Good evening. It is lovely to welcome you to Questions of Life. My name is Cath, and I'm here with two wonderful people this evening. We have Shrade the dog, who is asleep down here, but should be awake because tonight's going to be exciting. I'm also here with Donald.
Hi, everyone. I smell less than the dog, to be fair.
Yeah, apparently the dog smells. But it's wonderful to welcome you to Questions of Life. Now, tonight, we're talking about suffering. And as we mentioned that, you might think, oh, my life, the next 45 minutes is something to be endured and to be suffered. Well, you can help us with that. Please, would you, throughout this evening, text in or email us with your questions or your comments. We love hearing from you. We've got a couple of questions that we've already had in, one from Mike and one from Tracy, and we're going to weave those in this evening. But we would love to have more interaction from you. So you can text us on 0754 489 9698. That's 0754 489 9698. Or you can email us. What's the email address, Donald?
QOL@sebc.org.uk.
Fantastic. That is QOL@sebc.org.uk. If you email us, we have the wonderful Paula, who's at the other end of the email. Good evening, Paula.
Hi, Paula.
And she'll forward those to my phone. And throughout this evening, I will try and juggle asking Donald questions, trying to make some intelligent points that may not happen, and looking at your comments and your questions and weaving them in. Now, this evening, Donald, we're talking about suffering, and you've come in your shorts to just help us to get into the idea of what it is like to suffer.
Making you all suffer.
Making us all suffer. But suffering, I think, is a real stumbling block for many people when they start thinking about God and Christianity. So I became a Christian just before my 18th birthday, and it was one of those kind of, I was blind and now I see, kind of moments that I wasn't a Christian, and then I thought, this is what I want. And in that moment, it kind of just changed my life. And so I was really excited, and I just couldn't wait to tell my friends this incredible thing had happened. My life had been changed. And so I phoned up one of my mates, and I said, Neen, do you want to come out for a drink? Something amazing's happened. So we got to the pub, I bought her a drink, and I told her the story. I said, I've become a Christian. It's absolutely amazing. And she was great. She just sat there and took it all in and was fantastic. And she said, that's wonderful for you. That's great. You talk about this God of love and everything else. She said, but what about the children that are starving and dying in Africa? Where's this God of love? What about people that are murdered? And she sat there coming up with these questions, all to do with suffering. Been something that had been bothering her. And I was really quite taken aback because, I had this wonderful, wonderful news, and then she had this real issue with it. And the conversation didn't go so well. And we ended up in a bit of an argument, and I stormed off. And it made me think that I really need to get my head around this whole area of suffering, because it is a huge stumbling block. Why do you think people get so emotional and so angry towards God when we're talking about suffering, particularly those that would perhaps say, well, I'm not a Christian, I'm not that religious, but when it comes to suffering, there's just something it kind of evokes within them?
Well, I think paradoxically, it's part, for me, of the evidence of God, in that we all have an innate sense of justice. So there are things that we feel are fair or unfair, and things that we feel are unfair make us angry. We feel, why is this happening? Now, that sense of care and compassion on behalf of somebody else, that sense of justice that other people aren't being treated fairly by God, isn't really natural as an evolutionary process. So I actually think that our anger with God, in a strange way, comes from God, because I think God has created in us this sense of, we want other people who we don't know well, people who we may never meet, we want them to be okay, and we want them to be treated as fairly as us. So in part, I think anger about suffering and injustice, particularly on a global scale, is part of the image of God in us. It ought to make us angry. So I think that's partly, so I think in a way it's a good thing. I think, secondly, that this sense of anger sometimes is exacerbated by Christianity or religion when we try and convey that Jesus makes everything right, and Jesus fixes everything, and that there will as long as you have enough faith, as long as you believe enough things, you'll never be unhappy again. And there's enough satellite TV stations that promote that throughout the world, and that exacerbates, because we clearly see that isn't true, and so that can make us angry as well. And sometimes Christians try to defend God, so we try to cover up the suffering, and we try and distort suffering, we try and minimize it, and all of that adds to the anger. So those things, I think, contribute to us feeling aggrieved. And I think that all of that's natural and right. We ought to care. And I think suffering makes God angry. I actually think that the state of the world is not what God wants. It's not what he intended. And I think that is why he will return to fix it. I think that is why I believe passionately in heaven and a time when there's the opportunity for things to be put right. So all of those things sort of come into play. If this world is all there is, then I think we ought to be angry with God, if there is a God. What I also find interesting is that lots of people say, well, there can't be a God because we're angry with him. But it kind of doesn't work that way, because you can only be angry with somebody who exists. So I think it's right to be angry, but I think we need to be careful not to blame God for things that aren't his fault.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. We live very much in a society where we want to blame. You know, there's that whole slogan, where there's a blame, there's a claim. And as little children, we're always asking this question, why? There's something within the human race. Firstly, we want to know why something is happening, and then we seem to want to be able to blame, well, whose fault is it? So let's clear something up at the beginning, and we talked a little bit about this last week with coronavirus. Talk about whose fault is suffering, because there are people that are blaming God, it's his judgment, there's a whole load of other things. Whose fault is suffering, Donald?
I think fundamentally suffering is caused by the freedom of humanity and by our free will. And indirectly you can say God has created suffering by creating free will. But I think free will is really important and an essential component to life worth living. Simply because I think that the most important quality in human life is love. The greatest experience is to love and feel loved, to be valued, to be cared for, to be wanted, to be able to nurture others, to be able to give to others. That's the richest human experience. You can have all the money in the world, but if you don't feel loved, then it's worthless. And equally, you can feel loved and have very little money and still feel okay. So love is the most important quality in the universe. And I think that's the way God is created. God is love. He's created love. That's in his very nature. An essential component of love is free will. If you are compelled or forced or manipulated into actions, they are not loving actions. They are coercions. So in order for love to exist in the universe, there has to be the freedom to not love. There has to be the freedom to ignore. There has to be the freedom to neglect. There has to be the freedom to hate. In order for love to exist, there has to be the freedom to be self-centered, to put ourselves as the most important thing. So as much as I can choose to love other people, I can choose to love myself more than anybody else. And when human beings choose to love themselves more than any other human being, we bring suffering into the world. And we bring suffering into the world in two major ways. The first way is the obvious way, in that large amounts of human suffering is caused by mankind, either directly through war, through words that we say, and we talked a lot about that last week, or indirectly because of the economic structures that we create that favor the powerful and the wealthy. So we ask, well, why does God allow people to starve to death around the world? Humanity allows people to starve to death around the world. It allows people to have to build their homes on lands that flood more likely than anywhere else. It allows us, the economic system forces some people to build their houses on fault lines where there'll be earthquakes. So part of that is structurally our selfishness, that we in the West want to live wealthy, affluent lives, and so it suits us to have an economic system that allows others to be less advantaged. So in that sense, a big part of suffering is caused directly by human beings. The second part, which we talked about before in the last session, and you can find that on our podcast or the videos, the second part is that in order to put it right, God creates heaven, and he invites humanity to be part of heaven. And heaven is where the mistakes, the selfishness of this world is not repeated, where there is no more suffering and sin. There's no more selfishness. Because the people who go to heaven are the people who've recognized in this world they've done wrong and want to be different. The barrier to heaven is death. And I know I'm recapping a little bit of what we talked about last week. And therefore, when we chose selfishness, we brought death into the world. Death is the consequence of saying we can't live forever. This kind of existence, I mean, the suffering in the world would be epidemic if humans could live forever. It would be horrific. So death is a consequence of our sin. And once death is brought into the natural order of things, then people suffer because people are bereaved and people die in a way that's not what God originally intended and is not what happens in heaven. There's no death in heaven. So free will is the philosophical priority that creates non-love, which creates suffering, which creates death, which creates suffering. Perhaps you want to dig deeper on that or take me
Okay,
on.
so you're saying that God's created the human race as free-thinking individuals. So we're not these pre-programmed little robots that just do everything that God wants us to do.
Yeah.
That he's going to set us free. And he's set us free because he loves us. And he's set us free because he wants us to love him. And for us to love, as you said, that requires a choice. It requires for us not to be coerced or pre-programmed. And so God would have known the risks in giving the human race free will. He would have known that there would be some of the human race, as we see, that live lives that are a blessing, that do good and encourage and nurture and just bring great things into our world. But he would have known conversely that there would be times for all of us when we actually abuse our freedom of choice. And so that is what causes the suffering in our world today. As you've said, whether that's starvation in Africa, whether that's through the words that we say, through murder, through abuse. But God allows that and gives us that freedom because he loves us so much. That his ultimate desire is for us to know him. And so for him, that comes at a cost. That comes at two costs, really. It comes at a cost of having to watch on and see us completely wreck the world and wreck each other. And I suspect there are times as God looks out upon the earth that he is distraught, that he cries, he grieves, he sees how we interact with each other, head in his hands, just overwhelmed with emotion. And that's one of the costs that he pays. And the other cost that he pays is Jesus. And we've talked about that for the last few weeks and how Jesus' life and ultimately his death and his resurrection are the means through which that if we confess and we believe that we're then able to find forgiveness and new life in this lifetime, but we enter into what you're talking about, heaven and the afterlife, this place that is going to be absolutely awesome. And we'll explore that a little bit in a moment, because it is just fantastic. But how does that help us in the here and now? So we have a world that God's created. We have a God who loves us. We have a God who wants good things for us. But it doesn't automatically guarantee that good things are going to happen in our lives, that none of us are immune from suffering. What's God doing in the midst of all of this? Is he just sitting back saying, guys, I've given you this world. You've got freedom of choice. I'll see you at the end. What's God doing?
Yes, well, I think that there are things that God does to help us in suffering that for some of us are really, really powerful and significant, and for some of us are simply bandages and they don't really, only heaven will heal the real wound. But the kind of things that God does, firstly, I think he advises us, gives us instructions and directions on how to live a life that might reduce the suffering by avoiding certain mistakes. We've talked about that before. So all the instructions and values in the Bible about how to live truthfully, how to live in mercy, how to live generously, all of those things reduce our suffering. How to live healthily, how to not overindulge, all of that stuff is in the Bible, not to overeat, not to overdrink. So all of that affects us. So there is instruction on how to reduce suffering. Secondly, there is a real command and inspiration for the people of God to be alongside and in the midst of those who are suffering. And so we talked about this before, but wherever you see tragedy and suffering, there you will see, hopefully, the people of God, the Christians who are inspired by God to get their hands dirty and to share and to take risks on behalf of other people, or simply to be in the suffering with other people. So much of the caring antidote that humanity brings, you'll often find people of faith within that. It doesn't say that people with faith aren't part of it as well, very much so. But most Christians, once you've encountered God, you will be inspired to care and to help people who are suffering. It just becomes part of the relationship with God. So he puts that DNA in us to work and to care. I think the third thing that God does is he promises to walk with us. And so there's a phrase in the New Testament that talks about a peace that passes understanding. In other words, a peace that doesn't make logical or rational sense. And not every Christian experiences that. And maybe that's another session as to why we don't always experience peace and what robs us of peace. But for many Christians, the presence of God in prayer, perhaps in the company of other Christians in worship, perhaps just through reading scripture, it brings a sense of well-being. It brings a sense of strength and the ability to persevere and to endure and to overcome. And these are key New Testament ideas: persevering, enduring, overcome. Not going around a situation, but going through it and coming out the other side. And so I think many people who would call themselves Christians would be able to say that God has helped them deal with suffering.
Can you think of an example in your life, say, where you've seen God help you with suffering?
Well, loads. I would say that my own suffering is normal. I've been bereaved several times in life of close people and at a young age as well. So all of that's fairly normal. I wouldn't want to say I've had excessive suffering, but known premature death. My father, I have two very, very good friends, both killed in motor accidents. So I've experienced God being with me in the times of grief, and that he just brings a sense of peace to walk through that. But I think also that as a minister, Christian minister, I often am next to people at profound moments of suffering in their lives. So being with people who are dying, being with the loved ones of people who have just died. So I, if you like, second-hand encounter probably more suffering than an average person would do. So my own experience is probably normal, but my second-hand experience, my being next to people who are suffering, is probably greater than normal. And that can take its toll. You know, you go home and you think, it's hard sometimes to carry other people's pain and anguish. And in all of that, again, I've just known that God has been with me. And I keep going back to heaven. I cannot make sense of it without heaven. And there's a great quote that I use all the time. It's my favorite quote that you'll know. It's a quote from a guy called Thomas More, who was a guy in history, but he said that earth has no sorrow that heaven cannot heal. And that, for me, is the most profound thing that's kept me going, the knowing that there will be a time when this is all put right. And you talked earlier about God sitting back and letting the world be free. And I think it's important to say there's a boundary, there's a parameter that he says, look, you're going to have freedom, but you're only going to have freedom for at most 100 years. And for most of you, way less than 100 years. You've got freedom. And then heaven is longer than 100 years. So I may have 40, 50 years of suffering if I have a really difficult life. I may have 40 or 50 years of injustice, of suffering. And then it talks about heaven being longer. I will have 40 or 50 years of non-suffering in heaven, followed by another 40 or 50 years of non-suffering, followed by another 400 or 500 years of non-suffering, followed by another 4,000 or 5,000. Now, at that point, your mind begins to get befuddled and to take it all in. But that, to me, makes perfect sense of why we are free to be so unkind now. That it's limited to this time frame to ensure that the people in heaven are the people who want to be there. And that heaven will put it right. And the things that are so profoundly difficult now won't be forgotten in heaven, but they will seem like a memory that's gone. I don't know if you've ever had toothache or some really sharp pain, and in the middle of that pain, you think, I can't cope with anything else. This is all-consuming. It takes in all your mind. And then, for whatever reason, you're free. Tooth is extracted or whatever. You no longer have toothache. And after a month or two or a year or two, you still remember what toothache is like, but it doesn't carry that pain. And I think that's what the suffering of this world will feel like in heaven. We'll remember it. We'll know it. We know what happened. But because it will have been so long ago, and in comparison to the joy and wonder of heaven, such a short time, it will feel okay. Not perfect, not what God wants, but okay.